In this episode, we're going to continue looking at integration testing and end-to-end testing our book endpoint. Hi, I'm Mark Bradley and welcome to Testing All the Things, a screencast in which we use live coding to demonstrate different types of testing tools and techniques. In this episode, we're going to continue working on the book endpoint. We're going to look at handling the 404 resource not found error for books. Let's look at the code. In the previous video, we created the happy path implementation for our book by ISBN endpoint. In this video, we're going to create the not found part of that implementation. So let's look at the tests we currently have for that endpoint. Our end-to-end test, books. So we currently have one test in here that makes sure that the book exists in the database. Then we try to get the book by its ISBN in its URI, and we check that we get the book back. For the next test, we're not going to add a new book, and we're going to try to get a book by an ISBN that doesn't exist and see what happens. So create a new test. We'll call it get by ISBN that does not exist. And we can start writing our test. So we'll take the same client setup here. Okay. So we want an ISBN now that won't exist. So let's just add a load of 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There we go. So we're requesting an ISBN that doesn't exist. We know from our previous implementations, if Guzzle gets a client error returned or a 400 error, it returns an exception and doesn't return a response to handle. So we can get rid of our response. And we can go straight into try. And catch. And if we catch, so we can catch the client exception from Guzzle. We know if we catch that, so we can do $response equals new. Sorry, no, it doesn't equal new. It's e get response. There we go. And now we can make our assertions. So this, or in fact, let's just cheat ever so slightly and say, let's just do some quick copy and pasting from the now not found test. So there we go. That's exactly what we expect again. There we are. So we're all set up with this test now. So let's run the test and see what happens. So again, make test, and we want the Docker instances to shut down if the test fails. So we'll do Docker compose down. So our test has got an error. So we got a 500 internal server error instead of a 404 not found. So let's go and have a look at our code and see what's going on. If we open up our application first and follow the code through. So we know we get into this route here. We get a book repo that we created last time. So we know that exists and that works. Nothing's changed there. And then we call book repo get by ISBN and pass an ISBN for now something we know that's not in the database. So maybe the problem's here. Let's go and have a look at the implementation here. Apparently can't find the implementation for us, so open it from there. So we've got a public function, get by ISBN, takes a string ISBN and returns a book. So that could be where our problem is. So we're saying that we always return a book. But find by one, well, has multiple implementations. Entity repository. And it returns an object or it returns null. So that's probably where our problem is occurring here. So we need to add another integration test onto our book repository to decide how we want to handle a book not being returned from our Doctrine repository. So let's open up the test file and have a think. Right then. We need a new test. So we have a test method. And well, so we call again get by ISBN that does not exist. Okay, so don't need to do any of the book setup. We can just do book repo. Well, there we go. In fact, just do this. We need so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There we go. There's our ISBN for our book. Doesn't exist. Now, how do we want this to behave? So we could change the interface at this point of our get by ISBN function. We could make the returning of a book an optional book by adding a question mark to the return type. But I don't think that's going to be the best way to implement this. I think we'd be better off throwing an exception and then handing that exception later on. So let's do that. So let's take that off. And now let's expect an exception to be thrown. So we can do that quite easily. So this expect exception. Okay. And it takes a string, it takes a type of exception we expect to be thrown. Now, really, we want to handle our very own exception, so I think it's probably best we just create a new exception class at this point. There's no need to test it because it's just going to be extend the base exception and do nothing clever. So we'll call it book not found exception. Okay. Oh, and we get wow, I've tried that. That's quite cool. Extends exception straight off the bat. There we go. Let's try that out. Cool. There we go. That's our entire thing written. Lovely. We just tidy it right up so it's tiny. Lovely. There we go. Doesn't do anything clever, just extends the PHP exception. So now we can expect that in our repository test. So book not found exception. Okay. So we shall now run this test, see it, check it's failing. So the test failed because we didn't get our book exception and we returned a null. So now we can go and fix that implementation. So we go back to our book repository. We now want to catch the book that's returned. And then we can do if brackets book instance of book, we can return the book straight away. Okay. And then if it's not a book, we can throw new book not found exception, and we can do something like no book for ISBN. There we go. Okay. So we're throwing the exception. Let's run the test and see what happens. So we seem to be back to one error, so let's have a look at that. That is our end-to-end test. So it looks like now the implementation of our book repository is working correctly, but we're still throwing an exception that we weren't expecting. Let's have a play with that. Right, we now need to go back to our application again. We now know that book repository get by ISBN has the ability to throw an exception, but we haven't got any handling for this particular exception, so we want to remap that exception to something that the Slim framework can understand. So let's start by catching that exception. So try it. Try and catch. So we know it's a book not found exception, $E, and we want to map that into something that Slim can understand. Now, in our previous video, we created the API problem renderer that we allowed us to do. If we have a look at it now, open it. So at the moment, it only maps errors for 404s. So we could probably trigger that by throwing an exception that Slim will understand. So instead of getting a 500 error, because it's throwing an exception we don't understand, we can get it to start getting an exception that Slim can understand and remaps. And we know that that exception from last time is the HTTP not found exception. So if instead here we can do throw new HTTP not found exception. And now this is an implementation of a HTTP specialized exception, so we'll open that until that takes. There we go. That takes a server request, and it takes a message, and it takes the previous exception. So we can quite easily do this now. So if we go back to our application, we have the request already. Request, and add a message. No book found, and we can pass in the previous exception as well. So that's $E. Okay. So let's quickly tidy up before we move on. There we go. And let's run that test and see where we're at. So there we have it. the test is now passing. So we now have a book endpoint that can handle requests for a book and return the book if it's available. And when it's not available, it returns a nice clean 404 response with a nice message. So that's really great. In the next video, we'll look at what we can do when Doctrine cannot talk to the database. So the database has gone away or there's some kind of problem. And then we can start returning 500 messages from this API as well. I hope you enjoyed your video. I'll catch you next time. Thank you for watching this episode of Testing All the Things. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please rate and review the video and subscribe to the channel. If you did not and you have any feedback, please leave a comment in the comment section of the video or contact me on Twitter @Bradle.